When we think of ancient Greece, we picture marble temples, brilliant philosophers, and the birthplace of democracy. But hidden behind the beauty was a much darker reality, one built on broken lives and forgotten voices. Imagine being only 12 or 13 years old, sold by your family, chained, and dragged into a world where your body was no longer your own. While men debated virtue and justice in grand symposiums, children were suffering in silence, treated as objects for pleasure and power. This is the untold story of Greek slavery, the truth that history books rarely teach. And as you'll see, the shadows of this ancient cruelty still echo in our world today. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see history forever.
You wake to the scrape of iron against stone, the smell of sweat and olive oil hanging heavy in the air. The chamber has no windows, no softness. Its walls press in like a tomb, cold against bare skin. Your ribs burn with purple-yellow bruises that bloom like rotten flowers, reminders of last night's lessons. An iron shackle gnaws at your ankle, the wound raw, the skin cracked and bleeding. Somewhere above, laughter drifts through the marble halls of the master's house. It is not the laughter of joy, but the kind that sharpens your dread. Sandals slap against stone, heavy, deliberate. You know the sound before the door opens. The overseer. His bulk fills the doorway when sunlight cuts through the gloom. His face is a roadmap of scars and cruelty, carved by years of bending young bodies and breaking wills. He tosses a damp cloth at your feet. "Clean yourself," he growls. The master has guests tonight. His gaze rakes over you, clinical as a butcher appraising livestock. You'll entertain them. Your stomach knots. You've known what that means since the night raiders tore you from your village, since your family's debts were measured not in coins, but in your flesh. At 15, you've forgotten birthdays. Time doesn't belong to you anymore. You are property. And yet this was not rare. This was not exceptional. For countless boys in ancient Greece, this was the unspoken truth beneath the marble temples and noble words of philosophers. The textbooks polish the image of Greece into one of democracy, theatre, and reason. But behind the brilliance of Pericles, the words of Plato, the tragedies of Sophocles, lay a system built on silence, on exploitation so ordinary that no one questioned it. Civilization for some, chains for others. To imagine Athens, most people picture the white marble of the Parthenon gleaming in the sun, philosophers debating virtue in the agora, citizens casting votes on matters of law. But that light cast long shadows. Inside those shadows, children like you were stripped of names, families, and futures. The democracy of Athens was for free men only. Every bright ideal was bought at the price of invisible suffering. The overseer turns away, and for a moment, you are left with the damp rag in your hand and the weight of inevitability pressing on your chest. You are meant to serve wine, to smile, to be invisible, until the moment invisibility is no longer what they want. You know this routine, the preparation that disguises cruelty as culture. But here's the truth, often lost in admiration for Greece. For every symposium where men discussed philosophy and recited poetry, there were slaves oiling their bodies in silence, ready to be used as ornaments, as playthings, as proof of power. The same men who wrote of justice and virtue at daybreak turned to cruelty by lamplight. They didn't see the contradiction. Or perhaps they saw it all too well and chose not to care. Your hands tremble as you wipe your skin with the rag, the overseer's voice still echoing. You try to steady your breath. Perhaps you tell yourself that tonight will be no worse than the last. But deep down, you know, in this place, every night becomes worse. And in that certainty lies the cruelest lesson. Here, you are not a person. You are a story waiting to be forgotten. Long before you found yourself in the master's chamber, the path toward captivity had already been laid out, though you didn't know it. In the villages scattered across the Greek countryside, life balanced on a knife's edge. The land gave, but it also took. A single bad harvest could mean hunger. An illness striking a father or mother could unravel an entire family's survival. And in a world where debts were not erased but inherited, desperation often ended in the unthinkable, selling a child. Picture such a village. Mud brick houses clustered together, their thatched roofs sagging under years of smoke. The dirt floors were swept clean each morning, though they could never truly be clean. Families slept shoulder to shoulder for warmth in winter. Children, half naked, chased goats between olive groves. their laughter mingling with the sound of grinding stones, as women turned barley into coarse bread. Hardship was everywhere, yet so was life. Until the sky itself turned against you. One summer, the rains never came. Olive trees, some older than the stories told by elders, yielded only shriveled fruit. The barley fields crisped to brown stubble. Wells, the veins of the earth, ran dry. Fathers and mothers began to weigh their children's futures against the cruel arithmetic of survival. First went the animals, then the heirlooms, small rings of bronze, a necklace of beads. But when silver still could not be found, the creditors returned, and creditors did not accept promises. They wanted payment in flesh. It was not always war or conquest that stole children. Sometimes it was hunger. And when hunger met opportunism, the slave merchants appeared. They were men who moved like shadows between villages, their chains coiled neatly, their ledgers filled with blank lines awaiting names. To a starving family, they spoke of contracts, of years of service, of silver coins that could buy bread through winter. They offered hope, dressed as fairness. And parents, your parents, wanted to believe. You remember the day well, though perhaps you wish you didn't. The sun blazed without mercy as the merchants set up in the village square. Their voices carried promises as smooth as honey. Your child will learn skills in the city. Your child will return as a man with wealth. But the truth lay in the weight of the silver coins that clinked in your father's trembling hands, each one a piece of your future torn away. Your mother's face turned away, not in cruelty but in helplessness, when the merchant's hands pried open your jaw to check your teeth, when fingers prodded your arms, judging your strength as if you were a colt at market. The men recorded your age, your origin, your potential. Words like promising stock and suitable for household service floated in the air, but you didn't understand them. You were 12, perhaps 13, old enough to see shame in your father's eyes, too young to grasp the machinery of debt and survival. You only knew that the silver meant food for your family, and that you were the price. And here is the cruel irony history rarely admits. Greece, the land that gave the world philosophy, democracy, and theater, also perfected the buying and selling of human beings. They justified it, called it natural, even necessary. But beneath those justifications, it was always the same families torn apart, children turned into property, suffering disguised as economics. When your father handed you over, he likely told himself it was temporary. Perhaps he imagined you learning trade skills, gaining a place in a wealthy home, maybe even earning enough to return. But deep down, he must have known. Few who were sold into chains ever walked home again. That night, as you lay chained with other boys, you tried to remember his face, but what you remembered most was his silence, the silence of a man who chose between his child's freedom and his family's survival. A silence that would echo in you long after his voice was gone. The memory of that day still lingers, sharper than any blow. Your father's hand shook as the silver coins fell into his palm, each clink like a funeral bell. Your mother's shoulders trembled, though she would not look at you. You wanted to believe them when they whispered that it was only for a time that you would learn skills, return home with wealth, perhaps even with honor. But even then, you felt the sweetness of those promises drip into your ears like honey laced with poison. The merchant's touch was rough, not unkind, but utterly impersonal. He forced your jaw open to inspect your teeth. Another man tested your grip. Another ran his fingers through your hair to check its thickness and texture. They measured your body as if weighing livestock, speaking over you as if you were already an object. They called you well-formed, promising, good breeding stock. Words you didn't understand, but words that decided the price of your life. In Greek society, such transactions were not hidden in shadowed alleys. They were public, legal, and often celebrated. Debt slavery had roots stretching far back. Famines, wars, and endless rivalries between city-states ensured a constant supply of the desperate. Ancient records even show how families, when trapped by debt, offered children as guarantees of repayment. It was a practice the Athenians themselves called doulos, a term that would become synonymous with slave. You didn't know the history, of course. All you knew was the weight of eyes on you, your father's, heavy with shame, your mother's, wet with tears, and the merchant's, glittering with calculation. A boy of 12 or 13 could fetch a price that might sustain a family through a whole winter. To them, it was survival. To you, it was exile. That day you stopped being a son and became an investment. Your father took the money, though his hand trembled so violently he dropped one coin. You saw it flash in the dust, bright as the sun, before the merchant snatched it back. The sound of it striking stone stayed with you the moment when you understood you were no longer a child, but a commodity. Yet, what makes the memory unbearable is not just the betrayal, but the normalization. No villagers stopped the sale. No one spoke out. The system was too entrenched, too ordinary. People whispered pity, perhaps, but pity did not interfere with business, and so you were led away, shackled, one of many boys sold to pay debts that could never truly be erased. The philosophers who later debated the nature of justice, who pondered whether man was free by nature, never spoke of that moment. They saw no contradiction in writing poetry about beauty, while beauty itself was bought and sold in chains. To them, slavery was not an aberration, but the foundation upon which their society stood. Your mother wept as you were led away, but she did not stop you. Your father stared at the ground, the silver clutched in his hand like both salvation and curse. And you, still too young to understand the weight of what had happened, looked back only once. The sight of their backs turned haunts you more than their tears. In that instant, your childhood ended, not with the slow passing of years, but with the sudden clang of coin against palm. And history, so often written in the voices of philosophers and generals, rarely remembers that children like you were its truest currency. The first night on the road, you learned what it meant to be part of a caravan. Iron collars linked you to boys your own age, neck to neck, ankle to ankle, the chain running down the line like a serpent that owned you all. Each time you stumbled, the boy behind you stumbled too, and the overseer's staff would remind both of you to keep moving. By dawn your feet were already blistered, and you realized with horror that this march was not a day's journey, but a season's. You walked through landscapes that might have been beautiful, had you been free. Hills rolled with olive groves, their silvery leaves shimmering under the Sunday mountain, passes opened to eagle-filled skies. Coastal roads traced the glitter of the Aegean, the water sparkling like broken glass. But none of it belonged to you anymore. Your world shrank to the chain at your neck, the dust in your mouth, the sound of sandals scraping stone. At night, you were staked to the ground in groups. Iron rings hammered into the dirt kept you from wandering more than a few feet. You lay curled on your side, the earth cold against your cheek, listening to the quiet sobs of the younger boys. Some called out for their mothers until their voices cracked. Others whispered prayers in languages the merchants didn't understand. But every cry ended the same, with the sharp crack of a rod or the brutal silence of exhaustion. Along the way, buyers sometimes came to inspect the merchandise. They walked among the chained boys like farmers at market, their eyes sharp and calculating. Some checked for muscle-broad shoulders, strong calves seeking field laborers who could endure the Sunday. Others tested obedience, watching how quickly you bowed your head or followed a command, looking for household servants who would not resist. And then there were those whose touches lingered, their eyes hungry, not for labor but for youth. Those inspections were the worst, leaving you feeling skinned alive, your body no longer your own. This trade was not secret. In fact, it was the heartbeat of Greece. Athens, city of philosophy and democracy, was also one of the largest slave markets of the ancient world. Thousands passed through its stalls each year, sold and resold until their bodies broke. Slaves built the roads, quarried the marble, harvested the olives, served in homes, and entertained at symposiums. Without them, the glittering city would have crumbled. You did not yet know this. You only knew the road, the endless march, the overseer's lash, the salt sting of sweat in your eyes. You learned to stop asking when you would see home again. You learned to follow the rhythm of feet and chains, to breathe shallow against the dust, to endure. One evening, under the stars, an older boy whispered to you, "Forget your name. It will only hurt to remember it." His voice was flat, hollow, already broken. You pressed your lips together and said nothing, but in your heart, you repeated your name again and again, as though it might anchor you to who you once were. Yet with every mile, with every dawn, even that anchor began to slip. And still, the caravan moved on toward Athens, toward the market, toward the place where you would be transformed from a son into a commodity, From a boy into property, when the caravan finally reached Athens, the noise struck first. The slave market roared like a storm contained within stone walls, hundreds of voices colliding in shouts, haggling, cries, laughter, and commands. The sound was alive, almost monstrous, a chaos that swallowed your thoughts. Then came the smell: sweat, oil, urine, fear. Beneath it all lingered something metallic, like blood, that had long dried in the cracks of the stone. And then you saw bodies everywhere. Children barely walking, clutching their mothers' skirts, old men bent and broken, boys your age standing stiff as statues. Each one stripped, inspected, displayed. You realized in that instant that you were not alone in your fate. You were one among thousands, part of an endless tide of human lives flowing through this place. The merchants washed you and rubbed oil into your skin before leading you to the platform, not out of kindness, never kindness, but because oiled skin gleamed in the sun, muscles looked stronger, bodies more appealing. A sheen of sweat and olive oil could mean more silver in a buyer's hand. You stood in a row with others, your eyes downcast, though curiosity tugged at the corners of your vision. Buyers circled like vultures. Some reached to part your lips and check your teeth. Others pressed your shoulders, tested your arms, examined your posture. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the crowd, declaring your age, your origin, the shape of your body. His words were a performance, meant to stir interest, to disguise cruelty as commerce. Strong shoulders, gentle temperament, promising appearance. Each phrase was code, and though you didn't yet understand, the men listening did. The bidding began. Numbers rose quickly, shouted from the mouths of men whose robes smelled of perfume and whose fingers glittered with rings. You stood frozen, your mind shrinking inward, trying to disappear. But every raised hand meant you were more tightly bound to this system that now owned you. The man who won was called Lysander. You didn't know his name yet, only the way he looked at you even before the silver exchanged hands. He was soft-bodied, with the purple-dyed silk of wealth hanging from his shoulders, his beard trimmed and perfumed. His smile as he counted out the coins was not joy but possession, the satisfaction of acquiring something he believed was his by right. You saw no triumph in that moment, only the end of what little hope you carried. From the mountains of your village to the marble streets of Athens, the chain had led you here, to this platform, where a man's hand in the air sealed your future. What the philosophers never wrote in their treatises on virtue is how it felt to be that boy, to feel strange hands pouring at you, to hear your value measured in silver, to watch your childhood vanish under the gaze of men who saw you not as human but as property. And yet, here was the heart of Athens, not in the marble temples or the grand assemblies, but in this square, where human lives were bought and sold to sustain the brilliance others still celebrate. Lysander's house loomed larger than any building you had ever seen. Marble columns rose like frozen trees, their polished surfaces reflecting the late Sunday. Painted walls depicted gods, in triumph Zeus hurling thunderbolts, Athena crowned in glory as if the very stones declared the supremacy of their world. But inside, beneath the glittering mosaics and frescoes, you saw something else. Young faces. Countless young faces, each marked by the same mixture of beauty and despair. The man who met you at the entrance was Demetrius, the overseer. He was not free, not really. He had once been as you were, sold, trained, broken, but years of obedience and cunning had carved him into something else, a master of the enslaved. His gaze cut through you like a blade, weighing the fragments of will that still clung to your body. He recited the rules in a tone that allowed no doubt. You will eat when ordered, you will bathe when ordered, you will speak only when spoken to, you will never look a free man in the eye, you will obey every command without hesitation. And above all, you exist to serve the master and his guests in whatever capacity they require. His lips curled as he said it, a cruel smile born of long familiarity with breaking spirits. He led you down a narrow staircase, into the belly of the house. The air grew colder, damper. Stone walls pressed close, lined with small cells barely large enough for a straw mattress and a thin blanket. A chamber pot in the corner stank of waste. The walls were thick, built to swallow screams. This was to be your new world, the basement, the place of the forgotten. There were others waiting there. Marcus, a boy with eyes far older than his years, who had lived in this house for 2 seasons already. Alexios, scarred and wary, whose silence was heavier than stone. And Philemon, barely 14, yet already hollowed, his face carrying an expression no child should know. He spoke to you in whispers when Demetrius was gone, warning of the truth that lay behind the master's banquets. The symposiums where philosophers and politicians gathered to debate virtue while demanding cruelties that shattered it. Above your heads, the house glittered with wealth. Servants hurried through painted corridors carrying bronze trays, their footsteps light, their eyes cast downward. The mosaics underfoot depicted heroes: Heracles triumphant, Achilles in glory. But here in the basement, you began to see the irony. Those heroes, those gods, were celebrated for strength and victory. Yet it was the suffering of nameless children like you that kept these households alive, that allowed their masters the leisure to sing of philosophy and glory. In that first night, lying on straw in the darkness, you realized something. The house itself was a prison dressed as a palace. Its beauty concealed cruelty. Its art covered wounds. Its order rested on the chaos of broken lives. And you were now one of them. The first time you were summoned upstairs for a symposium, you didn't yet understand. To you, the word had meant something grand, something almost sacred. Villagers spoke of philosophers gathering in Athens to debate justice, truth, the soul itself. Men reclining on couches, wine cups in hand, discussing what it meant to live well. It sounded like wisdom dressed in celebration, but wisdom was not what you found. Hours before the guests arrived, Demetrius and the other overseers prepared you. You were stripped, scrubbed in water chilled from the courtyard cistern, and rubbed with olive oil until your skin shone like polished bronze. Your hair was combed, your body clothed in a thin tunic that clung to you more like a veil than a garment. Sometimes they added jewelry, bracelets, anklets, even a delicate chain around the neck, not for honor, but to mark you as ornament, an object meant to please the eye. The banquet began in elegance. Guests reclined on couches around low tables, their goblets filled, the air heavy with incense and roasted meat. Conversation flowed easily at first. Debates over war, laughter at witty verses, polished arguments about virtue and the nature of the soul. These were men of learning, men whose names would be remembered in history. They spoke as though they carried the weight of civilization itself in their words. And yet, as the wine deepened and the night lengthened, the room shifted. Laughter grew louder, the debates more careless, and then eyes began to turn toward you, toward Marcus, toward Philemon. Suddenly you were no longer invisible. A guest beckoned you closer, patting the couch beside him. His voice was gentle, coaxing you to pour his wine, to sit, to tell him about your homeland. His questions were innocent on the surface. Did you miss your family? Were you treated well? But as his hand slid from your shoulder to your back, then lower, you felt the trap tighten. You tried to move, but his grip was iron. Around the room, conversations faltered, laughter turned sharp, mocking. The others watched with the interest of spectators at a play. Your protests dissolved into silence. Your struggle met not with mercy but with amusement. In that moment, childhood ended not through age, but through violation. Later, lying on the straw in your cell, you felt the weight of what had been taken. Your body ached, but it was the emptiness inside, the hollow where dignity once lived, that cut deepest. You were not a person in that house. You were entertainment, like the wine, like the lyres, like the stories told to make men laugh before dawn. This was the symposium's other face, the one rarely remembered. The philosophers who debated the essence of justice, the politicians who thundered about democracy in the assembly, the poets who praised the beauty of the human spirit, all shed their public masks here. And they revealed appetites that their polished words never confessed. The same culture that produced the idea of virtue had no hesitation in consuming the young and powerless, and you, oiled and adorned, had become part of that contradiction. What happened that night was not an exception. It was an initiation. In the weeks that followed, you learned the rhythms of captivity, the cruel choreography designed not only to command your body, but to dismantle your will. At first, some of you resisted. Marcus had tried once, not long after you arrived. He slipped from his place during a chaotic banquet, bolting for the courtyard wall. He didn't make it 3 steps before the guards caught him. The punishment was public. They beat him until he could no longer stand, then chained him in the open sun for days. The message was clear. His limp would remind everyone of what rebellion brought. Others resisted more quietly, refusing orders, refusing to eat. But refusal here was never your own. The overseers had infinite ways to break you, withholding food, chaining you to the wall, or worse, placing you alone in the silence of the dark cell until even your own thoughts became unbearable. Some boys simply disappeared, sold, perhaps, to harsher places, or discarded when they no longer amused. You learned not to ask. The most powerful weapon wasn't the lash but unpredictability. You never knew when you might be summoned, what task would be demanded, how violent the punishment for the smallest mistake might be. That constant uncertainty gnawed at you, leaving you raw with fear, until fear itself became obedience. Then came the erasure. The name your parents gave you was taken and replaced with one easier on Athenian tongues. Your language was forbidden, your gods forgotten. You were forced to wear their clothes, eat their food, bow before their idols. Piece by piece, the boy who once lived in the mountain village was stripped away, until even you struggled to recall who he had been. And the men who demanded this were not faceless monsters, they were celebrated citizens. At the symposia you served, you came to know their faces. Dionysos, the politician who thundered in public about justice, delighted in humiliating boys, reciting Homer as if cruelty itself were poetry. Cleomenes, a wealthy merchant praised for funding public fountains, treated slaves as if they were clay to be molded through pain. And most chilling of all, the philosopher renowned for his treatises on ethics who could twist words into chains more binding than iron, justifying every act with the claim that some souls were born to be ruled. They did not see contradiction. To them, slaves were not people. The virtues they extolled applied only to equals. To property, they applied whatever cruelty pleased them. That blindness was not incidental. It was essential. It allowed them to build a culture admired even centuries later, on the broken backs of those history never names. Night after night, you felt yourself unravel. Each order obeyed chipped away at something essential inside you. Each humiliation, each silence, each forced smile taught you that dignity was a luxury you could no longer afford. You began to move with lowered eyes, careful steps, a voice trained to vanish when not summoned. The boy who once ran through olive groves now walked like a shadow, haunting his own body. And yet, in that darkness, a quiet truth took root. For if cruelty could be systematized, so too could survival. And survival, however broken, however small, was itself a kind of defiance. Time blurred in the house of Lysander. Days became indistinguishable from nights, and nights from years. At some point, you stopped marking the seasons, because survival no longer moved with the rhythms of the earth, but with the rhythms of cruelty. You learned, as all did, the small, invisible arts of endurance. The first was silence, not simply the absence of words, but a silence of the soul. When Demetrius barked orders, you responded without hesitation. When a guest's hand lingered too long, you froze into stillness. It was not compliance, not truly. It was retreat, the ability to sink so far inside yourself that your body became a shell, a puppet moving through motions while the last remnant of your spirit remained untouched, hidden. The second was observation. You watched carefully, memorizing the habits of those who held power. Which guest's smile meant kindness, and which meant danger. Which mood required obedience, and which demanded false laughter. You learned to anticipate before being commanded, to soften punishment before it fell. It was a delicate, exhausting performance, but it kept you alive. The third was community. Among the boys in the cellar, you forged a family of necessity. Marcus, limping but alive, taught you how to breathe evenly when chained in the sun, how to turn pain into endurance. Alexios whispered of small tricks, how to save crusts of bread, how to feign illness to avoid the worst duties. Philemon told stories in the dark, tales of gods and heroes, not to entertain, but to remind you that you were more than property, that once, you belonged to a people who also told stories by firelight. These bonds became lifelines. You developed glances, gestures, a secret language in silence. A quick look could warn of Demetrius's approach. A faint hum could calm a boy shaking after a night upstairs. You shared scraps of food, traded stolen moments of warmth, small acts of kindness, dangerous acts of defiance. Because in a world designed to erase you, remembering each other was resistance. Yet, survival had its own cost. You noticed changes in yourself. Your posture bent lower, your voice grew flatter, your smile became something you put on and removed like a mask. You found yourself grateful for cruelties that were less cruel, thankful for nights when a guest ignored you, relieved by punishments that left no scars. Gratitude became twisted, survival reshaping even your sense of what was good. The contradiction was unbearable. The very culture that recited poems about the nobility of man demanded your degradation. Men who debated justice by day justified torture by night. But you began to understand what made it possible. They didn't need to silence you with whips, because they had already trained you to silence yourself. That was the true victory of their system. Not just obedience, but the slow reshaping of the soul until even resistance felt impossible. And yet resistance endured, fragile but unbroken. In the darkness of the cellar, Marcus spoke of his sister's laughter. Alexios hummed a mountain song. Philemon recited the names of those who had disappeared, refusing to let them be forgotten. These were not grand rebellions, they were whispers against the tide, threads of memory against the machinery of erasure. Years passed this way, years measured not in birthdays but in scars, not in seasons but in symposia. You grew taller, your voice deepened, but inside you felt hollow, as though you had aged centuries in silence. You became a master of survival, yes, but each compromise chipped away at the boy you once were. And still you endured. It came not with a whip, not with a scream, but with a laugh sharp enough to sever the last thread of who you once were. It was during a symposium, unlike the others, one celebrating a military victory. The air was heavy with wine and arrogance. The guests, young aristocrats swollen with triumph, demanded more than conversation. They devised games, cruel competitions, each command more humiliating than the last. You were their centerpiece, their plaything. They scored points by how deeply they could shame you, how thoroughly they could strip you of resistance. At first you flinched, recoiled, still clinging to fragments of self. But then something shifted. As they jeered, as hands pulled and voices ordered, you saw yourself not as a boy enduring cruelty, but as an object exactly as they saw you. It was as though you stepped outside yourself and watched your own body performing, hollow, lifeless. That was the moment the boy from the mountains finally died. Oddly, the death of the self felt like relief. Without dignity to protect, there was no pain in surrender. You became the perfect slave, anticipating needs before they were spoken, smiling on command, erasing even the flicker of resistance from your eyes. Demetrius noticed first. You were rewarded with better food, cleaner clothes, even a cell with a window. A cruel irony. The more completely you disappeared inside, the more comfortable your shell was allowed to live. In time, you were taken to the market with Demetrius not as merchandise, but as proof. Buyers were shown what a well-trained boy could become. You stood silently as new children were inspected, your polished obedience used to justify their purchase. The irony crushed you. Once trembling on the platform, now you were part of the machine, helping to measure the worth of others. Then came the boy. He was small, 13 perhaps, with dark hair and frightened eyes so achingly familiar that you staggered. He looked like you once had before the chains, before the symposiums, before the hollowing. For a moment, something cracked in the numbness you had built. You remembered your mother's voice calling you home from the olive groves. You remembered the warmth of your father's hand, before it trembled with silver. You remembered being human. The boy was purchased by another master, spared your household, but his image haunted you. For weeks you dreamed of him. And in those dreams, you felt something dangerous stir. Not hope, not exactly, but memory. The memory that you had once been more than this, that the boy who died at the symposium still deserved mourning. Soon after, you overheard the philosophers again, debating whether some men were born slaves by nature. They spoke with ease, their words polished, their hands resting on cups of wine. You stood in silence, serving, but inside, you burned. For you knew the truth they refused to see. You had not been born a slave. You had been made into one, piece by piece, until you almost believed their lie. It was not ignorance that allowed them to justify cruelty, it was choice. They knew better and chose worse. By the time Demetrius summoned you one morning with flat, indifferent eyes, you were no longer surprised. He told you without ceremony, you were being sold. Not to another household, not to another symposium, but to the mines in the mountains. Your value had diminished. You were no longer beautiful enough, no longer young enough, no longer entertaining enough. In this system, once a body ceased to profit, it was discarded into the earth. The mines were where hope went to die. Everyone knew it. The work was endless, the air thick with dust, the tunnels always threatening collapse. The life expectancy of a slave in those pits was measured not in years, but in months. It was not execution, but it was death, slow and unrelenting. The journey to the mines cut through landscapes that felt both foreign and familiar. You saw mountain paths that reminded you of childhood herding goats, streams that glittered like the ones where you had once splashed with your brothers. But the chains on your wrists made escape a dream too fragile to hold. You walked silently, not toward freedom, but toward an ending. On your last night in the house, Marcus had slipped you a gift, a shard of metal, sharpened at one end. He said nothing as he pressed it into your hand, but the meaning was clear. This was a choice. A chance, however slim, to decide how your story would end. Escape, violence, or self-release. Options denied to most. You held it for hours, weighing each path. You imagined running through the hills, though you knew capture would bring torture. You imagined driving it into Demetrius's throat, though you knew the revenge would last only a heartbeat. You imagined turning it against yourself, ending the suffering by your own will. Each vision shimmered like a mirage, impossible yet intoxicating. In the end, you chose differently. At dawn, you hid the shard where another boy might find it one day. You would not escape, but perhaps someone else might. The gift Marcus gave you would not end with you. Even broken, you could still pass on a fragment of choice. The mines were worse than you had imagined. Narrow tunnels forced you to crawl, lungs filled with dust that scraped like knives. The air was wet and foul, the light barely more than flickering oil lamp. Overseers barked quotas impossible to meet, and whips fell freely on backs bent under baskets of stone. Slaves collapsed often, some never rose again. When they died, their bodies were dragged out and replaced by new ones. And yet, even here, in the deepest circle of hell, you found something unexpected. The slaves in the mines had built a kind of secret society, a fragile web of resistance woven out of necessity. They shared food when they could, carried the weak, whispered their stories into the darkness. They spoke names, kept alive the memories of mothers, fathers, children. It was a defiance the overseers could not beat out, the refusal to let memory die. You became part of that chain of remembrance. You told them of your village, your family, the olive groves, the laughter of goats in the fields. You told them of the house of Lysander, of Marcus, Alexios, and Philemon. You told them of the symposiums, the philosophers, the cruelty wrapped in reason. You gave them the truth that even in Athens, where democracy was born, children were sold like pottery. And they listened, they remembered. One night, as the dust clawed your lungs and your body weakened beyond repair, you lay down and did not rise again. You died quietly, without drama, in the darkness of the tunnels. But you did not die alone. Others knelt beside you, whispering your name, promising to carry your story into their own. And that is how you lived on, not in marble inscriptions or heroic verses, but in whispers, in memory, in defiance. History may have forgotten you, but you were not erased. Your story, like the stories of countless others consumed by civilization, echoed, carried forward by those who refused silence. And so we must ask ourselves, when we praise the brilliance of Greece, do we also hear the echoes beneath the marble? Do we remember the nameless who built its glory? Or do we, like the philosophers of old, blind ourselves to cruelty when it is convenient? For the truth is this: civilizations are always paid for in flesh. Then, as now,